gives its hope. Marcy listens to the whispers of stories yet untold. An adoptee, a mother, a scholar of the heart, she weaves the threads of science and soul into an art. With wisdom deep in early starts, where human roots are grown, she charts the map from womb to world, from seed to fully sown. Prenatal minds and tender bonds, neurobiology's grace. In every child she sees the light of peace the world can chase. She writes, she speaks, a guiding star for those who seek to raise a gentle world of thinkers kind, with empathetic gaze, parenting for peace. Her gift, a beacon's thoughtful gleam, where trust and wonder shape the minds that birth a wiser age. Teaches those who hope to guide life's steps before they crawl. With parents new and parents to be, her counsel spans the earth. Yet two bright souls, her E and Eve, remain her truest worth. So let us learn from Marcy's path, both rigorous and true, that peace begins before the breath in all we dream and do.
Welcome, Marcy, to
Hi.
this the days and works of Marcy Axness. Big honor for me to have you with us.
Well, it's an honor for me to be included in a group of pioneers.
Yeah, yes, you are. Well,
Thank you.
as you know, we started from the big start, which
The big,
is before
Mhm.
conception. So, what was the environment, the socio-historical, cultural environment at the time, around the time of your conception, which was in which country and which place in the country?
Well, mid-century modern, that's me. It's a big movement. Everybody's into mid-century modern style, and I am completely mid-century. It was 1955. So, just that classic mid-50s mores in California. So things were maybe a little bit more progressive here than in other places. Um, but it was the 50s, and you know, I think California in the 50s was in many ways a kind of a wonderland. It was sort of the epitome of the American dream for a lot of people, shiny and beautiful. And so that was the economic environment I was born into, or that I was conceived into, I should say. And
Right.
then, huh?
Come on, go on, please.
Okay, go. So, I mean, I always hesitate to become like a speech, like have an answer take 17 minutes. So just interrupt me anytime you want.
Yes,
Um,
I will.
so, you know, as we know in the field of prenatal psychology, the beginning really isn't just conception, it's the thoughts, the dreams that our parents have of us before conception. And that was not the case for me. My father, biological father, had recently left a marriage and a young son. And my biological mother was in her early 20s and met this guy, really liked him. And, they got together. And I was an unexpected, unplanned, one could say uninvited conception. And I will say that I really believe that initial, I don't like the term imprint. I remember somebody saying to me, we need to find a term that is more gossamer than imprint, right? But that atmosphere of invitation was always missing from my life. And I still feel it to this day, of that missing welcome.
Hmm.
So that was my conception.
Hmm. Right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Marcy. And in terms of values and principles and philosophies that the time and space was filled with in mid 50s California, what do you what can you recall?
Um, well, first of all, when it comes to me recalling anything, I have so a paucity of childhood memories, which becomes an interesting point a little later on, when I encountered the work of Clarissa Pinkola Estes, but I don't want to jump ahead yet. I do think that the mores of the time contributed to the fact that my birth father and birth mother, I was conceived in Los Angeles, but my birth father lived in Santa Barbara. And my birth mom, and by the way, in the adoption reform community, the term birth mother and birth father are now anathema. We're not supposed to use them. I can't keep up. I can't keep up with whatever the PC language is. I've always said birth mother and birth father, so I will continue to do so. So if anybody's watching from my adoption reform community, my apologies. Anyway, she moved in with him and they lived like they were married. They lived as man and wife. And I think that that very much speaks to the mores of California, Santa Barbara, quite progressive, even in 1955.
Right.
And so one day, mid pregnancy, she was having coffee and cigarettes, probably, with her next door neighbor, Marcy Densmore. And she just blurted it out. Bob and I aren't married. He doesn't want to get married. What am I going to do? And Marcy Densmore had a very, very dear friend who had been having some real reproductive challenges. And she said, let me get you together. And the rest was history. That was my adoptive mother and her husband came down and they met her and she moved up to San Francisco to be near them. And it was a very modern, really, really one of the very first independent, so-called private adoptions in the country for sure, and definitely even one of the first in California. Suzanne Arms wrote a book called Adoption, A Handful of Hope. And she has practically an entire chapter devoted to Phil Adams, who was the attorney who handled my adoption.
Right.
So it's all very cutting edge.
Yeah. Right. So uh, s- let's just, if you allow that, going focusing on your birth mother.
Mhm.
What kind of person was she or is she?
Um, she passed several years ago. I was with her at her deathbed. That in itself, the story of our relationship would take up 2 hours. So, but her name was Liz. And Liz was very refined, very artistic mind, pretty unconventional in her, I think, in her approach to life. I think she felt constrained by the rather provincial ideas of, that she might have found herself surrounded by. Her parents were pretty kind of proper, I think. Um, but one of the defining features of her, sadly, was that she was bipolar, which of course they didn't diagnose easily back then. Um, and certainly it's one of the features, genetically speaking, that I inherited. Thankfully, not the bipolar aspect, but I definitely have wrestled with depression
Mm.
um, over the years, unipolar, thankfully. Um, but we had a very storied relationship after we met when I was 21, and including a 10-year estrangement.
Mm.
But really, we had a lovely relationship in the last, you know, years of her life. And I realized that it was a challenge for me to enjoy, appreciate her positive aspects, because so much of that was freighted with unmet needs of mine, right? To be seen, to be understood, to, all these unmet needs that you carry forward. You didn't get that need met when you were an infant or a toddler, and it just carries forward and becomes, pretty inappropriate when you're, 25 or 35 or 50. So, but we did have some really good years at the end, so that was good.
However, this element of being unconventional, how has this benefited you? Can you
Well,
recognize it in any way?
it's hard to tease out, it's always hard to tease out how much is the genetic inheritance, the experiential inheritance of having been carried in her womb for those 9 months, um, and my own Aquarian
Mm.
inheritance. The Aquarian is creative and visionary and pretty much pushing against the world and always trying to make the world a better place. So it's hard to tease out what comes from what, right?
Yeah.
Um, Especially in an adoptive situation. Now, interestingly enough, my half sister, Liz got married soon after my adoption, and had two more children, and the older of whom is my half sister, also named Liz. That gives you a little peek into my mother's psyche. Um, she and I are like an N of two in terms of the study of, you know, sort of who fared better or worse, had more struggles being carried in her womb and then raised by her versus carried in her womb and then adopted out. Now, the fact is, I was adopted into an intensely unhealthy, just emotionally treacherous, just horrible situation, which she felt terrible about, decades later when she understood this.
Mm.
Um, but it's a pretty interesting thing. My half sister actually has struggled more with depression than I have. I've always managed, I've come to the cusp many times of trying medication, but I think I studied enough neuroscience to just really have a deep kind of appreciation bordering on like paranoia about how meticulous
Mm.
neurochemistry is, and to go in and tinker with it in what I think are some pretty, ham-handed ways that we do as you know scientists and pharmacy people. I've never quite done that, and so it's kind of interesting to look at you know, because Liz had to deal, little Liz, as we used to call her, my sister. Um, she had to then deal with the fact that Liz really, her bipolar continued to escalate, and there were suicide attempts and there was
Oh,
hospitalization. So yeah, it was sort of like pick your poison.
yeah.
Like a really horrible family, but didn't have that particular aspect to it. I don't know. It's, whoever knows really.
Yeah. And the biological father, what kind
Mhm.
of person was he, or is he still with us?
No, he also passed. He passed in like, I'm gonna say 2001, maybe.
Mm.
Um, we were actually estranged the last few years of my life after having been very, very close for a long time. You know, these relationships, they're so complicated.
Yeah.
um, and, and I think freighted. Bob, which is the same first name as my adoptive father, which always makes people confused. Honestly, my ex-husband, for sure, less so my current husband because everybody's dead already. But my ex-husband, oh my gosh, on the way to any family gathering, I had to go over my entire family bramble bush and all of the various complicated weird. It was very, very crazy. Anyway, so Bob, my biological father, was the youngest child of his siblings. And as such, kind of following what we know about, those youngest kids, he was really the black sheep. He really just went his own way. He again, it's sort of like I maybe inherited a triple um, inclination towards iconoclastic sort of attitudes and pushback, to the point where sometimes it's hard for me to, sometimes I feel I'm not fit for human for, for human contact or human society, because it's sort of like I push back on everything and get so impatient, which of course this is going to come up as we talk more about prenatal.
Right. And
But the main thing about Bob, about my birth father, that just really always rankled me was he was never able to hear or even just consider the fact that my being not even adopted, okay, when we talk about adoption trauma, it's relinquishment trauma. I mean, that's really where it starts. And in the womb, I mean, Liz told me very soon after we met, um, I don't believe in ownership of children. I was carrying you as a gift for B and Bob. So, you know, at the time, I was so mad. And she goes, oh, and I enjoyed my pregnancy. And at the time, I was so mad. All I wanted to hear was that she had been so just devastated and heartbroken and just really tortured at the thought that she was going to be giving up this child. And it was many, many years later when I got into prenatal that I realized it was really a gift to me that she had enjoyed her pregnancy. that said, she also had emotionally disconnected from me during her pregnancy, which I realized wasn't, that was something for me to, again, one of those sort of atmospheres that I would really live with all my life.
And
And then
you,
Bob was never able to really acknowledge even the possibility that it could be any kind of a trauma for me to have been adopted. And that was always a wedge between us.
yeah, you would say he lived in rejection or in denial in a way.
He just had his classic hallmark saying that he would trot out about anything was life can be beautiful. Just like really dismissive,
Mm.
of just any possible issues. And let's just be, I mean, maybe in another age or whatever, he'd be just like a surfer dude and just like, let's just go surf it out. I mean, I don't know, just kind of dismissive. And one of my really, really central issues, triggers, as the kids now say, um, is to feel unreceived, like unreceived and unresponded to. I mean, that really continues to be just something that can really send me. And that sort of was like I lived in perpetual, uh, in that perpetual place with him. Yeah, so we kept it really light. He was great with my son. He was, in fact, the thing that severed our relationship was when my daughter was born 3.5 years after my son, who he and his girlfriend had been so involved with, and just really delighted in. When our daughter was born, we asked them if they would consider being godparents to the kids. That's one thing that Bob could not tolerate, was anything that smacked of responsibility. And even though we absolutely assured them that this has nothing to do with finances or money, it's just to keep our memory alive for the kids if something happens to us. Now, he couldn't deal with it. And that was really the beginning of the tide going. I mean, he just went out like the tide, just.
Mm. So let's focus on the parents you grew up with. What can you share about your mom, or how do you call her now?
Um, my adoptive mother was mom. That was
Yeah,
mom.
what is the name?
B, short for
B.
Bernice.
B. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Well, I first of all, I will say a lot of these recollections, you know, Dan Siegel, Alan Shore, Bruce Perry, they all talk about this medicine of developing a coherent narrative.
Mm.
And that this is really one of the ways they can tell that it's one of the key markers of a person's attachment style, right? So I would say my entire life, really my entire adult life, has been about going back and collecting and weaving this coherent narrative. So a lot of it is retrospective. A lot of it is, it's been like a detective work, really, because I was so asleep and so, I really think, out of my body. One healer said to me in my 30s, your body's suffering because you're not in it. I think I was really out of my body for much of my early life. So this is a lot of this is retrospective, and I don't want to give the impression that these are like memories from
Yes.
that time. Okay.
Yes.
So B, I wrote what I called a fictional memoir
Mm.
back in my 30s, partly as part of this detective work. And plus, writing is I really consider myself, aside from mother, I consider myself as a writer, first and foremost. That is how I process, digest, work things out. as a writer. So I set out to write this fictional memoir, which is mainly memoir with a few bits of fiction thrown in. And one of the lines I remember writing about B relative to her daughter-in-law was that, she had really put somebody in a position. She really put her in a position. And I said, but that's what B did. She put people in positions. She was a machinator. She was really, I guess we these days maybe say a narcissist. She grew up poor in Canada, a scrapper. Part of the reason I wrote the novel was because there were just so many like crazy stories that I was like, people would say, oh my God, you should write a book. You should write a book. So finally I decided I'm going to weave it all together. And that's what I did. So, but in terms of B, she met Bob, my adoptive father, on a trip to Jamaica. She and her girlfriend went from Canada, took a 2-week trip to Jamaica. Bob was there completely separate on a trip from Chicago. He was a wealthy Chicago scion of a wealthy Chicago family. They met, had a fling. Oops, she got pregnant. Oopsie. That was very 50s, by the way. That was a very 50s thing to do, was to trap some wealthy guy into marriage by getting pregnant. And I absolutely believe that's what happened. He brought her home to his aghast family. What you would call, this is a horrible thing, but kind of like trailer trash from poor Canada area. And she had the baby. It had Down syndrome. Bob would not allow it in his house. Not only would he not allow it in his house, he told all his friends it was not his, it was fathered by a Jamaican. That baby was put into an institution, died when he was 14 months old. I sent off, when I started this novel, I sent off for all of the paperwork. I sent off for his birth certificate and his death certificate, because he had always been this weird mythological specter that mom used to call Tiny Tim. Anyway, B got pregnant very quickly after that, because remember, she's trying to hold on to this guy. And if she, again, very 50s, very, very 50s. And she didn't get pregnant, he could just, send her back to Canada. She got pregnant. She had a near fatal miscarriage. Doctor said, you cannot get pregnant again. And that's when they set the wheels in motion, moved on to California, and set the wheels in motion to adopt me. So this is the space into which I was adopted, to take the place of this dead Down syndrome baby.
Yeah.
Who my father had disavowed, but my aunt went and saw Tim at the institution when he was around a year old. And she said he was the spitting image of Bob. And so, you can see how the ground was already laid for just this emotional treachery between the two of them, the betrayal she felt. The day that they were to take him to the institution, he called her and said, I'm busy at work, you're going to have to go by yourself. And it was horrible. And she had affairs, and it was just, I was really adopted as ballast for this marriage. And this was confirmed, by the way, when I was actually doing interviews of the few people who were still alive, the few still living witnesses to any of this. This woman who had dated my father, and I think always was really in love with him, but lived nearby us in Marin County. I knew her as, Aunt Mary Alice, and she was always so sweet to me. And she was the one, when I went and interviewed her, she kind of hated to say it. She said, this is just awful. But she acknowledged that that's exactly why B wanted a child. So, and it was really, I have to say, it was Bob's sister, my adoptive aunt, Edie, who had been living in Chicago, but when she heard about them adopting a child, she was my guardian angel. in the flesh. Absolutely. She moved out to Tiburon. She built a house on the empty lot next door to theirs, much to my mother's chagrin because they hated each other. And she was the one who made really the huge difference in my life. Without Edie, I'd either be dead or I'd be wishing to be dead, I would say. Um, yeah, she was. So I call her my aloe mother. I've written blog posts on Mother's Day, about my three mothers, and I write about all three of them, and but it was really Edie who gave me whatever lifeline and sense of security and predictability that a young child needs.
Mm. So quite great, I would say. The experience, your early experience weaves a huge tapestry of a lot of experiences one might have over a number of lifetimes, not one.
Yeah. That's funny you should say that. It does feel like I compressed a lot of life experiences into that. And so I had mentioned Clarissa Pinkola Estes earlier. So I I ordered the audiobook of her. She had something called Warming the Stone Child, Myths and Stories of Abandonment and the Unmothered Child. And of course, that jumped out at me. I ordered it immediately. And I still, Olga, I remember to this day exactly the piece of LA freeway I was driving on, the Hollywood freeway, when I heard her say, in terms of suggestions, ways to kind of access your early years, especially, if you feel you have no childhood memories, which I really felt I didn't pretty much. She said, think about what was your favorite song or your favorite movie or your favorite book. And when I first heard that, I was like, oh my God, I can't remember anything. How am I going to remember that? However, it's like we're all familiar, I'm sure, with how, if you seed your consciousness with a question and then let it percolate, a little while later, it'll pop up. Sure enough, I remembered that the book Thumbelina, I had a beautifully illustrated book of Thumbelina. And I remember I could picture myself sitting in my room in that Tiburon house and just like almost like living in those pages. And so I sent off for it immediately, obviously a newer version. And I just it's about an alien tiny little girl navigating her way through such dangerous and yet kind of beautiful circumstances and finding her way through. And you know just circling back for a second to this idea of a coherent narrative, um, and this process of developing it over my life. And they say that this is how you develop what they call earned secure attachment style, right?
Mm.
I would say that my life and ultimately my work, which is so steeped in my life experiences, um, was a very iterative narrative weaving process, which for me was, definitely not linear, not in neat layers. They say, life is like an onion, you peel one layer at a time. It wasn't neat at all. It was almost more, you're Greek, you'll appreciate this. It was more like phyllo dough, just kind of like messy and a little butter in there and then another layer, but it doesn't go all the way across. And that actually is what it feels like it was for me, kind of seeming haphazard, but ultimately coalescing into something that was really vibrant and vital. Um, so the Clarissa Pinkola Estes, yeah, like this Thumbelina navigating her way through really dangerous circumstances. I mean, my Bob got polio. We went to Mexico for a water skiing trip. My parents were pioneers. Speaking of pioneers, they were pioneers in bringing recreational, well, any kind actually, of water skiing out from the East, where it was kind of big in Chicago, or Midwest, I guess that is, out to California. They were some of the first. And so we went down to Mexico for a water ski trip, someplace called Lake Tescatango. And my dad came down with polio there.
Mm.
This was right when the polio sugar cubes had just started, and he had said, that's just for kids. And he got polio. So we were stuck in Mexico City for 6 months. And my mom was, B was not the nurturing mother. We had housekeepers and hired help at home. She didn't have them with her. She was like, what do I do with this kid? So she shipped me off to American kindergarten. I was only 4, um, which was like a fever dream. That was terrifying. That is, I do have some like shards of memories from that. And then she would like foist me off. um, we'd go to the hotel we were staying in or whatever. She'd foist me off, as I wrote in the novel. She'd foist me off onto a bus boy or a bellboy, some kind of boy, and where I was inevitably sexually molested. There was definitely some of that in my childhood. And so, yeah, this Thumbelina feeling alien, feeling apart. I when I send you the pictures, you can show this picture of an artist I got turned on to in my 30s who would take these old black and white baby pictures, and she would embellish them with paint and turn them into what she called bug babies. And I bought one, and I mean, my kids, as they got older and could really understand what they were like, ew, what is that? It was such a mirror for me because it showed this baby with little talons and antennae and little pointy toenails in such an alien way. That's how I felt.
Mm.
And one of my favorite um, qualitative pieces of research about adoption was a study of adopted adolescents. And they would use, this term kept coming up, these terms, alien, flotsam, having fallen out of everydayness. That's one of my very favorite things. I felt so mirrored by that.
Mm.
Anyway, I'm on to that 17-minute monologue, so I'll stop.
Mm. So actually, in the houses, in the family surroundings, what were the stimuli that you conversed most of the day? Because I
Probably,
hear pioneer spirit, yeah,
I mean, housekeepers, hired help. And in fact, one of the key articles, one of my first published pieces, in a magazine here in LA that I published was called Many Hands,
Mm.
um, which was a play on words because my mom had an artisan store down in downtown Tiburon called Many Hands,
Mm.
which I'm sure had beautiful pieces. I was not old enough to really appreciate that, but she was always down there. And so there were many hands that were hired to tend to me, right? And by and large, I believe they were wonderful. I think probably the hired hands. I do remember Hilda and Walter, who worked for us when I was around like 6 or 7. They were a British couple. Walter did the gardening, and Hilda was the housekeeper. I think by and large they were wonderful and probably were a godsend to me. One of the few memories I do have from childhood was me just sitting in front of the huge picture window,
Mm.
looking out over Lyford Drive, which is the road that would come up from the main highway down in Tiburon to drive up to our house. And I would just sit and I would be watching it for my mom's car, I guess.
Mm.
Yeah, so there was a lot of,
Uh,
I mean, it was very neglectful.
have you got any memories of siblings or grandparents in the sea?
Um, in the what?
Uh, in
Oh, the
your
sea.
everyday, yeah.
No, I will say, so that Jamaica trip where B met Bob, um, she had taken off from her husband and her 8 or 9 year old son, Brian, to go do this trip. And this actually inaugurated divorce proceedings. Who knows what had gone on? I mean, honestly, it was just all so gothic. But Brian ultimately came to live with us in California. So I had this stepbrother, Brian, no, not stepbrother, no, not stepbrother. He was really my adopted half brother, right? The full son of my adoptive mom. Brian was great. I mean, I have I have little memories of him like riding me around on my trike, when I'm like 4 and he's 15 maybe. I don't know. But he he got a friend pregnant when he was 19 and she was 17 or something like that. And I remember being the flower girl in their wedding when I was 7. So he was out of the house, pretty early. And really just was not a very big fixture in my life. There were no grandparents. It was a very isolated, my mom's uh, parents were in Canada. I met her grandmother. I mean, I met her mother, my Nana, once or twice, uh, just very briefly in visits. Um, my Bob was really quite a bit older. He was like 12 years older than my mom, who was 35 when I was born. So, his parents, I never met them. I mean, there was just not much of a concept of family
Mm.
other than, Edie. Edie really was my safe haven. And I could just toddle down the stone steps down to her house. And I did, like, all the time.
So Indy was not married, or was she married?
No, Edie, again, speaking of the 50s, Edie was, a lesbian at a time when, that was, I mean, I only came really to that recognition I mean, after her death, because a child doesn't think in those terms,
Yeah.
right? I had a girlfriend who, once I was in like junior high and high school, she would like make fun of her sort of mannish looks. And like it just was over my head because when someone is that really, she was my mother figure.
Mm.
You just A child doesn't have that perception, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, what a story. Condensed
I mean,
story.
it's not much of I know that your research is about finding the common threads that led people to go into prenatal. Mine is no great mystery, right?
Well, actually, in your life, there was a lot of pioneer spirit in a way that one could recognize as different from being a pioneer in health
Oh,
or in science or in whatever.
absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Edie was absolutely a pioneer in her family, not just because of her sexual orientation, but she was the first one to ever go to analysis. I
Mm.
mean, in the 50s, that was crazy,
Yeah,
like cutting edge.
yeah, right. So, uh, actually, when did you realize that there were specific traits that guided you along the way that later on brought you to speak and advocate for adoption, etc., etc.?
Hmm. Well, I mentioned my Aquarianness. Okay,
Yes.
so there's that. Soon after my second child was born, I had a Chinese face reading. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but um,
Yeah.
and she looked at like the curl of my ear. She started at the curl of my ear.
Uh-huh.
And she said, just as a matter of fact, as the sky is blue, she said, "Oh, you marked very early. You're going to have to go back to the womb to get back to your, your core issues." She just said this like, tra la. Um, and then I will say, um, as she went on with my face reading, she kind of had this aha. She was like, "Oh, now I know the name for this nose, because this nose is very like I was adopted by a Jewish
Yes.
father. It always looked very Jewish. It turns out it's Scottish, but she said that's the truth teller's nose,
Hmm.
and that landed so um perfectly. I mean, it just was like such a full body yes for me, because honestly, I would say that's one of the traits that all of my life has been, kind of a defining feature, and has lost me a lot of friends, I think. I am a freaking truth teller. I am not about being PC. I am not about beating around the bush. I'm not really about small talk. I just, you know, I'm like, I want big talk. That's how I've always been. So, I went to my first therapist at age 21. I was having intimacy issues with my first boyfriend, and she was in the psychodynamic modality. She worked, and she said it was as if you sat up in your crib, looked around, and realized you could only depend on yourself. There was nobody else around for you. So all the focus of that year of therapy was really on the neglect in my home. Believe me, there was plenty to work on in just my adoptive family, but I look back and I find it staggering that there was never any mention, let alone exploration, of the fact that I was adopted, that I was birthed by a different mother, separated from her. That just never ever came up. Um, and I was thinking about this in thinking about talking to you today, and I had this thought. It hadn't occurred to me before, but I feel like my progression of therapy modalities, because I've been in therapy all my adult life, not straight through, but um, successively. Um, my progression of the modalities sort of echoes what we've learned as a field and as a culture about the effectiveness of different interventions and the relative effectiveness of them and the sort of layered effectiveness. So I start with psychodynamic, which is talking. And then my next one, which just I've been led very much by life. I absolutely believe, I have a very spiritual framework to life. I believe there are unseen guides, and I believe in angels, and it's kind of a pastiche of esoteric, but I was kind of guided weirdly to neo-Reichian and biodynamic.
Ah.
Um, so I did that for 3 years. That was my next one. So that was real body based. It's like the stories in your body. And of course, and that was in 85. No, 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 before that. Sorry. That was in like 80, starting in 82, 82, 83, 84, something like that. So that was pretty early on, compared to our broader understanding, I think, as a culture, in the power of somatic approaches. Then after that, I did some sex abuse specific work with hypnosis, then primal. That really was the first time I went into the pre and perinatal, my own prenatal stuff, then somatic experiencing. So it's, again, it's this layered sort of approach. And I think also the progression of my therapies also demonstrates the rarity, especially that first therapy, the rarity of a clear-eyed understanding of adoption trauma or relinquishment trauma. Um, So because I mean, honestly, my first APA conference in 93, I remember having a chat with the president of APA at the time, and the topic of me having been adopted came up, and she got that instant, like, that face, that like whitewash of adoption face, that adoption is all rainbows and unicorns, and somehow that the laws of nature and attachment and the need for bonding all are suspended when adoption comes into the story. So I was kind of shocked at that. Um, so anyway, I've seen my journey of developing that coherent narrative hand in hand with healing, and I always put quotes around that because whatever that is. Uh, so all of that I see, to answer your original question, as a weaving and an intersection and a sort of synthesis of traits and circumstances. So like my traits, but then circumstances, adoption. Like I didn't design that, although some people, and maybe even I would say I designed that as well. The whole James Hillman thing, that's a whole other thing. Yeah, so
So
I would,
that is already 2 decades in your life, right? Because you mentioned that it was about the 20s when you started the psychodynamic work with you, right?
I was 21 with the psychodynamic, and then I believe I was about 25, 24 or 25 when I started with the neo-Reiki and the biodynamic.
Right.
The
Good.
body-based. Uh-oh, it's my alarm. Let me take my allergy pill.
Yeah. Okay. In as an adolescent, do you remember yourself having exhibiting any traits in exploring either narratives because you were in writing and in on the TV and on other parts, I would say disseminating or sending out interesting information about whatever this
Hmm.
about. So could you
That,
see that starting earlier than
that,
the 50s, 20s, mid 20s?
um, honestly, I think there was a huge inflection point for me at age 21, which is when B died. I think that was a liberating thing. I have often made the sometimes considered dark, humorous joke that my parents had the good graces to die young. Um, that's part of my trait too. I have dark humor. I'm irreverent to a fault. Um, but as an adolescent, I would say that my traits toward pushing boundaries really came out more in my fashion sense. I was always the one, because my mom was a manager at Joseph Magnin, which at the time was a very trendy boutique store. Um,
Mm.
and so I was always wearing the latest fashion, sometime to the great ridicule, to great ridicule. Um, and I was also a theater nerd. So I was really kind of channeling. I think that the theater thing appealed to me because I could be somebody else, or kind of step out of myself. And in fact, I will say, I hadn't thought of this. This is actually in one of my booklets. I wrote a couple of booklets in a series that I called Adoption Insight. And it was always envisioned to be a three-part series, but I never got around to number 3. But in the intro to number 2, which is about the primal issues in adoption, I shared this experience that I had at my first acting class. I majored in theater at UCLA. And my first acting class, one of the very early things that we did was, we had to do scenes. And a friend of mine, Stacy, and I did a scene from Stage Door. And, it's a very dated, kind of 50s thing about two young women trying to make it on Broadway. And she comes rushing in the door. No, I come rushing in the door with the fabulous news that we've both been cast in this play. And the scene just fell flat on its face. And so the teacher told me to go outside and he was going to give Stacy some other information and we were going to do like an improv on it. So he gave Stacy some secret information. I come bouncing in the door saying, we've both been, we're making it. We've made it. They want us. We've been cast in this play. And she's got this glum look on her face. And I'm like, what? And she said, well, they just called and I was cast, but you were not. And oh my God, all I will say, I mean, I just dissolved into tears and I somehow kept saying lines that seemed relevant, even though I was just absolutely choking with tears. People came up to me on campus for weeks after that, basically saying that was amazing. And they thought I was Meryl Streep, right? And really all that had happened was they had tapped into that atmosphere that I carried inside me, which David Chamberlain once said, being adopted is like being invited to dinner and then asked to leave when you get there. And I've had that happen too, and had a similarly dramatic response to it. Anyway, my miraculous acting skills, vanished as soon as they had appeared. But that just goes to show you, like, just how available that material is, and how it's not like buried deep somewhere. It's right there, available to be called up. So that just occurred to me. That was one of the first like little bells. It's almost like little bells are ringing saying, come, there's something for you to find, something for you to find. And actually, oh, what was I going to say about UCLA too? I took a journalism class in my junior or senior year, and I ended up, I don't even know how I was led to this, but again, kind of this flukish thing, kind of the same way I ended up with the Neo-Reichian therapy. I ended up doing a piece on Jay and Margie Hathaway about Bradley Bradley husband-led childbirth, which I'm sure they've changed the name by now. And so, like, what was that about? I just, it's these little bells are ringing saying, come, there's something for you to find. And
But
then
were
go
you
ahead.
willing to follow the thing, the bell? Yeah. Were you
Yeah.
willing to follow?
Yeah, and I credit myself for that. I think there's a lot of people who get the bells and just don't. And so I honor that in myself. When I was pregnant with my first child, I did read Thomas Verney's book. Um, you know, um, oh God,
The life
you
of
know,
the unborn
The
child?
Life of the, yeah, that one. Um,
Yeah.
and The Secret Life. That's
The
it. The
secret.
Secret
Yeah.
Life, the Unborn Child. Okay. And it's so funny because I still have that copy and I see that I highlighted some things and I wrote in the margin Liz question mark about like my own pregnancy, my own gestation. And yet it didn't really permeate all that deep, or I thought. And Ian was born, and as I have written often, motherhood brought me to my knees, man. It kicked up all of this old material. And I had what would really be classified as postpartum depression. And ironically, nobody identified it. And I didn't either. I really wrestled. I had a hard time. Um, And I even there was somebody very progressive at my chiropractor's office when I was pregnant who said to me something like, when you're holding your baby in your arm, hold your own self as that baby. And I thought, what the fuck is she talking about? Like I just it didn't land at all for me. And but my daughter, who was born 3.5 years later, she had the exact same gestation schedule that I did on the calendar. And they talk about anniversary memories, and they talk about how that is a very real thing, and it's linked up with the, I don't know, circadian and seasonal rhythms, whatever. I don't really understand it all. But my daughter was due the day after my birthday, which I thought, that's going to be a problem because I love my birthday. I don't want to be sharing it with anybody. So, my husband, my then husband, and I went to our season ticket Sunday matinee of LA Philharmonic, and we were sitting there, and I was just feeling so weird, just really weird. When I think about it now, I would describe it as psychic nausea, like something deep was threatening to come up. But at the time I didn't know what it was, but I felt so odd, and it was still 3 weeks away from due date, but we were like, you know what, let's not take any chances. Let's just go home. We got home. I walked right back to the bedroom. I didn't even say hi to, that was Bob, my birth father, and his girlfriend were babysitting our son because they were really close at the time. I just marched right back to our bedroom. I stripped off my clothes. I climbed into bed, and I started to have what I now recognize as a spontaneous pre-birth memory. And I just was crying and crying. And then the words just came out of my mouth. They didn't go through my head first. They just came out of my mouth. I don't want to come out. She's going to give me away. Mommy doesn't want me. That's what it was. Mommy doesn't want me. Mommy doesn't want me. That just kept coming out of my mouth. And then I just went and purged from every orifice. And then Eve was born the next day. Super fast delivery. And so I mean, that was a watershed moment for me. And I realized I didn't really complete the answer to your question in terms of that inflection point of my mom dying when I was 21. I really felt that liberated me in ways that I can't really even articulate. It just liberated me. So I would say that Eve's birth, was a really bigger bell. That was the next in a series of these little bells, but that one was really clanging. And I remember calling my mentor in the field of adoption. I hadn't talked to her since I did a piece on her back when I was a television producer. So let's see, this was 92 when I called her, maybe, and I had done the piece in 82. So 10 years prior, I had interviewed her. And actually, that piece that I did with her had ended up nominated for an Emmy Award, but we hadn't been in touch all of these years. She did not seem shocked at all to hear from me. And I asked her this question. I said, I'm pondering this question of whether adoptees might come into the world already wounded. And Annette did not miss a beat. She was like, well, she said, there's this woman named Nancy Verrier, and she's talking about something she calls the primal wound. And she said it real like it was this exotic thing. And this was 92. So Nancy had written an article for the APA Journal. She hadn't yet written her actual book, which came out, I believe, in 94 and rocked the world of adoption, called The Primal Wound. Anyway, that really kicked stuff off. I was seeing a chiropractor at the time who did something called network chiropractic, which is just a series of very gentle, I wouldn't even call them adjustments, gentle manipulation or something, activation of the meningeal sheath around the spine, which is where some people believe like a lot of cellular memory is is held in the body. And I will say I had a couple of just amazing sessions, where she would just do this and then she'd go away for 15 minutes and come back and do it again. And things would come up out of my mouth. That's when I had I don't want to come out because she's going to give me away. And then also, she doesn't want to keep me, but she won't let me go. And, just these free floating memories came up. And then right around that same time, turns out I had a very flukish connection with David Cheek, one of them big pioneers. When we're talking about pioneers, unfortunately, he didn't live long enough for you to interview him as part of your series. But David Cheek had been my B's gynecologist back in Northern California and had treated her during her ovarian cancer. And so we had, so somebody put me in touch with David and we spent this lovely afternoon together and he did a regression. Anyway, so I would say, 92 is when really things started to pick up speed like exponentially for me in terms of this, awareness and all of these ahas.
So it is about a decade after the initial liberation in your 20s, right?
A little more than a decade. A decade after that is when my son was born, when I was 31. Then my daughter was born when I was 35. So it's a little more than a decade, but it was in that next decade, in my 30s.
Yeah. And your then husband and father of the children, how did you come to be together and then not be together?
Well, one of my very favorite writers and thinkers about relationship, Harville Hendrix, who wrote a book called Getting the Love You Want, his whole concept of the imago and this idea that we will go out and look for love that feels like what the atmosphere that we grew up with, right? So, I met John when he was an editor. I was back when I was still a television producer. My pre-motherhood life was producing television. And he was an editor. And so we spent many dark hours in a dark edit bay editing. And sort of over time, I came to, the familiarity of that atmosphere, plus he was good looking and he had a good job. And I was at a point in my life where I felt like, okay, I'm ready to take that next step. Like, it's those steps. It's like, well, I'm in my late 20s now. I better get going. And so it just, that's sort of how it developed. And I, at that point, was at a point of psycho social emotional development where I now recognize and have for a long time that I would not have been ready for a man who wanted to go deep and wanted to see me and wanted to know me. Like that would have been terrifying because that would have been so foreign. But I will say that back at Channel 2 at CBS News, when I was doing what they called sweep series, little documentary series on different topics, I did a sweep series on bulimia. At the time, they were still trying to decide what to call it. Some people were calling it bulimorexia. Anyway, so I was right on that cusp of when it was being talked about. And I remember interviewing a couple. We drove up to Santa Barbara to interview this young couple. This young woman had, with the help of her husband, healed herself of bulimia. And I still, honestly, I remember so vividly and can still hear the soundbite in my head because we did use the soundbite in the series. But I remember, basically when I asked her, I was off camera interviewing, what was it about him and his help that that you feel helped you heal? She said, he wanted to know me, and I had never been known before.
Mm.
And that it's almost like it went in me like a little time capsule. Like, this is going to mean a lot to you later.
Mm.
And I mean, honestly, when I say that, I still can kind of feel tears come. It's so poignant. He wanted to know me, and I had never been known before. So I I don't fault John or myself. You know, we were where we were. He didn't ask to know me, and that was fine. I didn't ask to know him. You know, we had this really wonderful, fun, wonderful, many years of it were wonderful. We were married for 25 years, so there was many good years. But motherhood for me changed everything. I was faced with this, in a way, a fork in the road. I could go the way that my mom had, which was to shunt off parenting to somebody else, so I didn't have to break those places open. But that's where those traits that we've discussed, the Aquarian, the push backer,
Mm.
came into play. And I remember Aunt Edie, you know, in one of the last years of her life, she died just a few months after my daughter was born in 91. She did say to me in one of her Mother's Day cards, she said, I am so proud of the mother you've become. Because she, of course, I'm sure, was holding her breath. She knew that I had not been mothered. And so she knew enough about psychology to know that, there's a good chance that she's not going to be a great mother. And so, she was very, very pleased that I stepped up and kind of took that on. But that meant changing. And in many ways, I changed the rules. It's like I changed the rules of the game. Like, I want you to want to know me now. Oh, well, that didn't really fit with our original contract. And we did a lot of counseling, and, we worked hard, and we had about as conscious of an ending as you can. And we're still very amicable, and we're very, very good to this day, co-parents, now, gosh, it's hard to believe. It's 9 to, I don't know, we ended in '09, so whatever that is, 15 years later,
Mm.
16 years on. Yeah, so we're still very good parenting co-parents. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, right. So we could say that the second significant transformation or threshold is giving birth to your children, Ian and
Uh,
Eve, right?
oh yeah.
And
Oh,
when
yeah, and I mean, I would say that is the primary one. I could have gone the rest of my life completely sleeping if it hadn't been for that. Yeah, no, they absolutely, that was, motherhood broke me open, and then challenged me towards more wholeness. That's what I would say. Yeah.
and when did you start? Do you remember when did you start consciously? I will do something about it.
Hmm. Um, well, I think, when I had that face reading, that was one beginning, and that was probably in 92 when I was 36. Um, and then I remember, circling back to Annette Barron, who had turned me on to Nancy Verrier, and I read all of her, a lot of her stuff that I could get my hands on. And that's when I think it was at Annette Barron's kitchen table that I was like, well, what can we do? Like, how can the things get better? I remember her saying to me that day, and unfortunately, things have not gotten better. She said, when you can advertise for babies next to the Hondas in the paper, you're in trouble as a society. Anyway, so I was going to go to another conference of American Adoption Congress, which I had been to in the past. And she said, no, 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 come with me out to this little tiny open adoption conference in Traverse City, Michigan. And there you can see where real cutting edge stuff is happening. So I went out there. And actually, I would say that was an inflection point in terms of you had a little while ago, you asked about when I started speaking or writing. Um, a woman got up to talk about the adoptee's pain. And I had just started my own primal therapy. So obviously I was all like, set afire. You have that initial, it's like after you drink a cup of coffee and you're just, da, 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 you want to just spout it out to everybody. But I didn't feel, I felt like there was still, I felt like there was still something to be said. And so I went up, this was a perfect example of my, what I would say is audacity. I was pretty audacious about this. I went up to Jim Gritter, who just wonderful Jim Gritter, um, who was the conference organizer. It was held through Catholic Charities out there, and I said, I said that. I said, I think there's just I think there's more to be said about the adoptee's pain, and could I have 5 minutes at the podium? And bless his heart, he said, yes, after lunch, you can have 5 minutes. And I got up and I, did my little thing. I think I took 6.5 minutes. And that was really the beginning of really, honestly, along with Michael Trout, I would say that I think Michael and I are really the only people talking about that intersection of pre and perinatal psych and adoption.
Yeah.
And so I got the sort of the key points out there. I didn't remember at all what I had said when I got down from the podium, but that was the beginning. And then I was invited, amazingly, to be on the faculty of future Traverse City conferences. And that was really one of the beautiful, beautiful parts of my life in terms of my public life speaking. And then I wrote tons of articles in the 90s there were a lot of different magazines, Roots and Wings. And this is so quaint right now because this was before the internet, the ascendancy of the internet. So these were for paper magazines like Roots and Wings. And I would write one of my favorite articles ever. I wrote for the California Association of Social Workers, a little article about honest talk about adoption. And so that was the beginning, really.
And Marcy, you already mentioned Michael Trout being on the scene of the adoption and some other names. How would you speak about your specific contribution apart from whatever already was there? You already mentioned that in that specific conference, these 5-6 minutes that you were given, you spoke about something painful that has never been voiced.
Right,
So
right.
what do you think is your own special contribution to the field?
Honestly, when it comes to adoption, it's one single hallmark concept that everything I've written about has been woven about. And it really was in that tiny article I wrote for the California Association of Social Workers newsletter. And that was, can't we just say what's true rather than saying these happy slogans? Everyone else had to take what they got, but we got to choose you. Or God meant us to be together. These bromides, these hallmark mythologized, sort of fictions that they're well-meaning, they're meant so that the adoptee will feel good about it, but they are at their core lies. Can't we just say the truth? We all came to this relationship having lost tremendously. You lost your original mother. You lost that connection. You lost that heartbeat, that smell, that atmosphere. we lost a sense of our own capability as humans, as reproducing humans, and our confidence, and and then the birthing mom, the biological mom, she lost a child, whether or not it was her choice, whether or not the circumstances warranted it. We all come from loss. And if we could just recognize and honor and say it out loud, what a fruitful foundation on which to forge a truly honest and intimate relationship. That's really the hallmark of everything I ever spoke or taught about in adoption, you know. Um, and and honestly, I I I always feel like I have to acknowledge that, obviously it's no mystery what drew me into prenatal perinatal as an adoptee, that virtually all my research has its seeds in my own story. And so really my own psychohistory is my research foundation, right? Um, and that's part of that iterative philodo of my coherent narrative, but it's all very, very rooted in my own um, story. And as I was setting out to write that fictional memoir, I went back to some old journals from my 20s maybe, and I saw this line that I realized that is the hallmark of my life. The line said, "I need to know how things will always be." And I mean, that's ultimately all of my study and all of my work and all of my therapy. It all kind of ultimately still comes down, distills to that. I mean, and this dynamic tension, I would say, that I am that I'm always navigating, of recognizing and honoring that unmet early need of ever knowing how things were going to be the next minute, let alone the next day, while also leaning into trusting life and tolerating that being in the not knowing. So that, really, we come full circle to sort of just this very simple concept, you know?
So
And I recognized at a certain point, I I recognized that the adoptee does not have the corner on these issues, that many, many people are conceived without being attended. Many, many people are gestated in a stressed or ambivalent womb. Yeah. And in some ways, adoptees have a leg up because we know what happened to us. How many people had those circumstances and yet were raised in everything's nice, and that's a bit of a gaslight kind of experience. And so that is really what propelled me into choosing for my doctoral studies to early human development, something a little bit more broad, more universal, just really looking at how our very earliest experiences affect all of us.
so actually, you were prepared very well, as a big mouth and a big truth, right? Truth
Yeah,
talker.
yeah, I'm a big mouth.
So you challenged the culture of the days,
Mhm.
in this field, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Even to the point of, you know, like I said, a few ABBA people who are like, "Oh, adoption, that's so beautiful." I'm like, "What?" Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It depends on who you are talking about, and whose
Mhm.
needs. So that was that is the main contribution. How did you serve it, Marcy? I mean, you already spoke about writing, and you
Mhm.
already spoke about speaking about it in congresses or conferences.
Mhm.
Would you like to include the other things that you have done in this direction?
Well, um, I right around the time my marriage ended, I had just started to write. I knew I wanted to write a book, and I got my doctorate in finalized it in early 2000s, like 2003. And I had a small private practice, what I would call a boutique practice, counseling parents. And that was beautiful. I mean, that was really lovely work. I loved working directly with parents, many of whom came from our Waldorf community. Both of my kids were, at a Waldorf school.
Yes.
And that was lovely. But I knew I wanted to somehow write a book, but I was really casting around for, the last thing we needed was another parenting book, really. I mean, there's so many. And I don't know, somehow ultimately ended on this idea of, if we want to change the world, let's raise a generation hardwired for peace. And how do we do that? And I just took everything I knew. I mean, honestly, my favorite, to me, the best thing about my book, Parenting for Peace, is that it's kind of like a Cliff's Notes of some of the top thinkers' best nuggets. It's a one-stop shop. You can read, Joseph Chilton Pierce, Bruce Lipton. Obviously, you want to go to their original book as well, and so I really just synthesized that. And I also reached back a lot, I would say, to my doctoral dissertation, which I had taken that fictional memoir and done chapter by chapter contextual essays. So diving into the research that spoke to the issues that the protagonist was dealing with, right? And that was really, I was very proud of that dissertation. I'd love to publish it. And I've got a hair. I hate that. I sold sets of it at conferences. Um, you know, a, a handful of people have this. I've got a hair in my face. Anyway, so I reached back to that a lot. Um, sorry,
Yeah.
the
Sometimes.
static electricity. There we go. Um, anyway, and so I synthesized and I distilled and it's like I just squeezed the nuggets out of these concepts, and I came up with sort of a rubric, like a seven steps through time, and then seven principles to follow at each of the steps. And the steps begin pre-conception. So chapter 5 of the 7 steps is postpartum. So that shows you just how front loaded the book is in terms of what we know about how most fruitfully to nourish and nurture development that early. And so I would say that that book, Parenting for Peace, is really, besides my children, my proudest achievement for sure. I did a lot of traveling, a lot of conference talks in the couple of years after the book came out. And yeah, I was very pleased. It sold decently for a parenting book, for a book from a small press with no promotion behind it. My one heartbreak about the book, I will say, is that it came out the same year as we hit what they call the tipping point for handheld devices, where 50% of people had handheld devices. So I don't address that issue in the book, which I feel heartbroken about, because it is really, I think it is the issue of the day for parents today. So I did do a blog series on my website in the few years after that, but
And you can still write a next book.
I don't think so.
You never
When you're
know.
ready, we can talk about my retirement. But I have to say I had some pretty remarkable experiences in terms of, honestly, I would call them demonstrations of the power of pre and perinatal. One woman that I was counseling during my practice came to me with some issues with her daughter who had been conceived through IVF, and she had some, I don't know, she was just having some issues. And she proceeded to describe a an event that happened one afternoon in which she had to take this long pool, like a pool pole, whatever, like a long pole that you use. Oh, that's what it was. Yeah, those long poles that you use for opening clerestory windows. That's what it was. And she had this pole and she was coming near her young daughter, and her daughter freaked out, just flipped out. And finally, she realized that it had to do with this long pole. And so she just like threw it out the back door. And so as we were talking about this, I just, intuitively, and this is where all of the, steeping oneself in this knowledge for years comes into play and is such a gift. I just said, did you have amnio with her?
Mm.
And the look on her face, it's like she got it. She just knew, oh my God. Not only had she had amnio, but she had had a very traumatic amnio that went a little bit wrong and grazed the baby's head, this daughter's head. Anyway, that was one. I mean, there were many over the time. My son had, he emailed me one day. He was in college and he talked. I could tell in his email, like he even went to all caps in his email and described what I could feel was like a panic that the library was going to be closing and he didn't know where he was going to go. Like he didn't have plans for after that. I don't remember the exact details, but it was something like that. It was panic about this library closing. And that is what inspired me. For my birthday was coming up then, and I made an appointment with Wendy McCarty.
Mm.
And we explored this issue because Ian had the cord very tightly around his neck, and
Mm.
pushing him out had been a huge urgency. It was like, got to get him out now. And so Wendy and I were able to work in a transpersonal way. And a long time later, I talked to my son about this, and I don't think he ever had that issue again. I mean, it's quite amazing.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
The levels
Oh,
of reality that we live with that we don't really recognize, but that are always working in our life.
yeah, that's true. So, putting all this together over the years that you have been contributing, writing, and advocating for the cause, uh, what would you like to communicate to those health professionals who are relate or focus their work on adoption and adoptees and adopted parents, or people who are thinking of adopting a child? What would you like to communicate to these professionals?
Well, I still meet monthly with Michael Trout and a group of his professional colleagues, and we talk about this. And it's sort of the never-ending conundrum, because there seems to be there it's just an ongoing, that's what it is. It's a conundrum. There will always be families who, there will always be fertility challenges that end up, in pursuing adoption. And I guess really the bottom line is always remember that the baby is watching, the baby is learning, the baby is remembering, and that really adoption is meant to give homes to babies and children that need them, not to give babies to homes and parents that need them. And, it's a tough pill to swallow. Annette Barron, she was like, not, there's no guarantee you get to have a baby. And that's a very unpopular, un-PC opinion, especially now with IVF and, all these reproductive technologies designed to, some would say, outwit Mother Nature. I don't, that's a
Yeah.
controversial position. But really, the baby, as long as we focus on really the baby's needs, and it seems so simple, but very often simple principles are not that easy to enact and to follow. So that's what I would really say. I think that everything matters, including consciousness, the consciousness with which we navigate our circumstances. I have seen the power of intention absolutely work, and the finding of meaning and beauty in whatever moments that that you can, that brings great enrichment. Rumi, the wonderful Sufi poet, wrote that there are 100 what was it? There are 100 ways to kneel and kiss the ground. Let the beauty that you love be what you do. There are 100 ways to kneel and kiss the ground. And Joseph Chilton Pierce, I mean, he was a huge, huge influence on my life and my work. And he used to urge people to live in constant astonishment. And you mentioned the concept of wonder, I think, and curiosity. That's one of the things that I discovered was really, honestly, one of the keys on which turned my first marriage was a lack of curiosity, which sounds so simple. But in order to be curious, you have to be vulnerable, be willing to be vulnerable. And that is not always the greatest commodity.
Yeah.
So yes, intention matters, consciousness matters. And at the same time, the psychosocial circumstances of the best of intentions, for example, in adoption, in surrogacy, they don't magically erase Mother Nature's very stringent rules regarding bonding, attachment, and malattachment. Malattachment is a concept that I came up with in my doctoral dissertation. We've got nourishment, that helps build the body, and then the lack of that is malnourishment. So I came up with malattachment.
Yeah.
Which is a concept I would love to see taken up more.
And what would you communicate to, decision makers and policy makers who have something to say in this field?
I would say, please, please devote resources to parent support, parent education. I mean, honestly, that is where the sweet spot lies. I absolutely believe that. Help parents understand that it's okay and desirable to acknowledge that your child has lost something. For the adoptive mom holding that adopted baby, who won't stop crying, or conversely, won't cry at all. That's equally troubling. I know I'm not the mom you expected. I know my heartbeat is different. I know I don't smell like what you were expecting, but I love you and I'm here for you. And I'm I'm able to hear all of you, your sadness and your happiness. You know, it's okay to say, I'm not the mom you expected. It's okay to say, you're not the baby I expected. I mean, to be honest, people think they're not allowed to have these feelings. Not only are they allowed to, they really should be supported in doing so rather than glossing over with these handy slogans, these slick,
Mm.
emotionless slogans. God meant us to be together. You didn't grow under my heart, but in it. I can't stand that poem. And I think a lot of adoptees feel the same. The sentimentality, the sort of hollow sentimentality that absolutely glosses over what we may really be feeling.
Marcy, if a child, let's say 5 years old, a young child who is adopted, came to you and asked you, why did my mom leave me? What would you tell that child?
Are you saying a 5-year-old?
Yeah, 5, 6,
Well,
very young.
well, I'll tell you what, I will answer you by sharing an actual story from my life, from my daughter. Kids love to hear about the day they were born, right? And so Eve was, I don't know, 3, 4, maybe 3. And I was telling her about the day she was born. And she stunned me by saying, "Tell me about the day you were born." I totally was not prepared for this. I hadn't really thought about how am I going to tell my kids about adoption.
Mm.
But there I was on the spot. And so I winged it. And I think I did a pretty good job. And I basically said, the mommy whose belly I was growing in didn't have the things she needed to be a mommy. She didn't have a room for me. Rooms are very big, especially for girls. She didn't have any clothes. She didn't even have a daddy for me. And so there was another lady who really wanted to be a mom, and she had all these things, but she didn't have the baby. I can't remember exactly how I did it, but it was something along these lines, just in very basic terms that a 3-year-old could understand. And Eve's eyes were locked on me. I actually tell this story in the book, I think. Eve's eyes were locked on me, and they were kind of swimming, almost like with little tears. And after I stopped, it was very brief. There was this silence, and she asked me, "Did you get to say goodbye?"
Mm.
And so it's like, God, out of the mouths of babes, children know. Children know about connection and disconnection and just needing to say hello and goodbye.
Mm.
And so I, you know, I would have to think about that one, about a 5-year-old, and
Yeah,
and I would also have to know their circumstances. But yeah, typically my counseling practice was with parents, not with children.
yeah.
So
But parents who will adopt or have adopted, there is a moment when they face this question from their child.
Well, I honestly believe that the child should never have to ask the question and should also be able to ask any questions. But honestly, the concept of adoption should be living in that family from the very beginning.
Yeah,
There should be pictures, there should be scrapbooks, there should be life books. The day that we brought you home. I do not like the concept of gotcha day. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, something called gotcha day, which is sort of like a birthday that adoptive
yeah,
families celebrate the day that they gotcha. I don't really like it. It just feels flippant. to me. But yeah, that story should just always be alive and just always be part of the conversation. Um, not in a oppressive way or like an um, overbearing way, but it just should be always alive and available. And that is where we do run into some challenges because many adoptive parents, certainly back in my day, were taught that the child should be as if born to you. I mean, that was the sort of the gold standard of how an adoptive family was.
Yeah.
And so that really encouraged a lot of denial, which many adoptive parents appreciated because very often it's sort of like they go right from the recognition of the fertility, the insurmountable fertility challenge into adoption planning and into the adoption process without taking a beat, without taking a moment to like grieve that loss. And
Yes.
the notion of grieving a loss is, it's not a monolithic thing. It's not like, oh, let's pencil off 2 weeks to grieve our loss. It's not how it happens.
Yeah.
But to lay that conscious, to enter that atmosphere of acknowledging this is a loss, this has been a loss, this will continue to be a loss. It's not a finite moment in time. But if it isn't acknowledged and kind of addressed in a sort of a welcoming spirit, uh, it does enter into the life of the family and it changes it.
Right. So actually, a lot needs to be revised because the protocols in the adoption centers or institutions do not reveal, they keep secrets, uh, they advise parents that are to adopt a different way. So there is a lot that needs to be revised.
Yeah. That's why, this little adoption conference that I used to attend in the 90s with Jim Gritter, it was so wonderful. It was a completely different model, but it was a very rare
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, that's right. So what did you study, Marcy? And what is the theme of your PhD?
Well, like I said, I realized that adoptees don't have the corner on any of these issues really, other than being separated from mother at birth. But so many of the other really salient issues are not unique to the adoptee at all. Um, and so I pursued early human development, which
Mm,
is itself a very highly interdisciplinary course of study. So, I mean, everything from, prenatal psychology, obviously, developmental psychology, developmental neurobiology, um, even even some uh, theology,
mm.
because honestly, the beginnings of life, it does get into theological issues for some people. So it was a very broad course of study, kind of wide ranging, which made me unhirable by basically once I got my degree.
Yeah.
By the way, even interdisciplinary departments or interdisciplinary courses of study in universities in this country, they want specialists that they can plug in to their interdisciplinary program.
So I said that I attended a speech you made lately, and I could hear you speak about quantum physics and cosmological laws, etc. And I was really very happy to hear that. So my question before ending this wonderful meeting is, what do you feel or think are the future perspectives or trends in the field of prenatal sciences. Where would you like to support the movement towards what, or what you think is significant to be included?
Well, that's interesting. Maybe you heard my um, my talk on conception as the Big Bang, or I'm not sure which talk you heard, but yeah, I have done a talk for chiropractors that and a more general audience, or maybe in 2019 in Denver, I don't know. But you mentioned the trait of optimism earlier, and I have to confess to a certain wearying, or what do I want to say? Waning, that's the word. Optimism. My optimism has been flagging.
Mm.
I feel that that we've made very little progress in these 30 years that I've been doing this, and in some ways have gone backwards, actually, as we watch technology in all its hubris zoom forward without always having a full understanding or even desire for an understanding of all the various aspects that the technology may be interrupting or disrupting or perturbing even. So, my dream would be for there to be an expanded level of recognition that there are these other aspects that maybe need to be recognized, which means really ultimately, as I'm saying this, what I'm realizing is a slowing down. Can't we all just slow down a little bit and breathe a little bit and say, okay, when we do IVF, we are supplanting the first 5 days of post-ovulatory development. What might be happening during those days? It comes back to that quality that I just mentioned to you, Olga, of curiosity. It is such an important and rich quality, curiosity, to be willing to ask what is happening here, what might be happening here if I didn't intervene.
Yeah.
So that would be my dream. I fear it's idealistic. I have definitely been idealistic in my time. I think I'm a funny mix of idealist and realist, and sometimes cynic. So those are my wishes. Meanwhile, I meet monthly with Michael Trout and other adoption people, and we sit on this conundrum, and not sit on, we navigate it. And it, so often feels like 3 steps forward, 5 steps back, 1 step forward, 4 steps back.
So let's both ways for this utopia to become an Eftopia very soon.
Ectopia. That's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Marcy, for bringing all this richness of your understanding and contribution to this field. Thank you.
You're welcome. I want to say that I feel extremely grateful and humbled by the invitation to be part of this. I really I just want to recognize the pioneeriest of the pioneers, if you will, people like Otto Rank, Frank Lake, and then of course David Chamberlain, Thomas Verney, the Alessandro Piantelli, that wave of pioneers, and I'm definitely in a later wave of pioneers. People like Jenny Wade. I hope you've considered interviewing Jenny Wade. She was very, very influential on my thinking. So I really appreciate being here. And now, like I said, I am in retirement. You said maybe you'll write another book. I will say, and I want to say this because people might find it helpful, a helpful perspective. I think people don't know until they are in it, how retirement is going to feel for them. It's kind of the great unknown in a way. I believe that I'm having the opportunity to fill in what they call in Hakomi body work, missing experience. The infancy and the toddler years of just the ease of being without having to be alert and savvy and hyper vigilant. That's what I'm getting to experience. It's 3 years now in retirement. And I think that that's probably a really unexplored aspect of retirement that deserves appreciation, if not investigation.
Yeah, you see, Marcy, you make a very interesting point. Very interesting. The Western values or the cultural values of the days are that we invest in getting to know what is productive, efficient, strong, powerful, etc. And
Yeah.
we marginalize such aspects of our life, such as retirement or looking
Still,
after
stillness and rest. Oh my
stillness.
God.
Yes, yeah, or
Quiescence.
reflecting.
Yeah, what cell biologists would call quiescence, which I love that word,
Yes,
quiescence. Yes,
yes, it's
I
very
am quiescent.
beautiful. Very beautiful. Yeah, perhaps we need to remind ourselves and the younger professionals now in the field in their 30s, 40s, or these decades that prenatal psychology should also be contrasted and analyzed together with pre-death psychology.
Yeah, well, they say it's a circle, and so they're right next to each other on the circle of life. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.